In the last section, we made a very small change to our pod configuration file, updating its container port. But when we did so, we very quickly saw an error message that said that we were not allowed to update certain fields that are tied to a pod. So essentially that message is telling us that there are some fields that we are allowed to update, such as the image that a pod uses, but there are other fields we are not allowed to touch at all once the pod has been created. And so this kind of flies in the face of everything I just told you about making changes to a configuration file. In other words, how are we going to change a configuration file to change an object inside of our cluster if there are fields that we are not at all allowed to update or touch? Well, to solve this issue, we're going to start making use of a new type of object that is going to replace our usage of pod inside of our very simple application as it stands right now. So the new type of object that we're going to make use of, in addition to pods and services, is something called a deployment. A deployment is a Kubernetes object that is meant to maintain a set of identical pods. So that can be 1 pod, 2 pod, 3 pod, whatever number. And the deployment is going to constantly work to make sure that every single pod in its set that it's supposed to manage is always running the correct configuration and is always in a runnable state. In other words, it is not crashing or it's not dead or anything like that. Now, a deployment is very similar in nature to a pod. Yes, I just said a deployment contains a set or maintains a set of pods, but at the end of the day, we can use either deployments or pods with Kubernetes to run containers for our application. So let's compare and contrast some of the differences between pods and deployments. So with the pod, we're running a single set of very closely related containers. Remember, in a pod, we're only going to stick in multiple containers if they have very tight integration with each other. In reality, pods are only used in a development environment, and usually only if you have like a very one-off single container or a very small group of containers that you want to run. We do not actually make use of pods directly in a production environment because of all these limitations around being able to update its configuration and stuff like that. Now, a deployment, on the other hand, again, is meant to is meant to run and manage a set of identical pods. So that is one or more. That can be 1 pod, 2 pod, 3 pod, however many you want. In that set of pods, every pod is going to be running the exact same set of containers with identical configuration. Now, the deployment itself is going to monitor the state of each pod. It's going to watch the configuration of each one. It's going to make sure that every pod is running the container successfully inside of it. If any pod happens to crash for any reason, the deployment is going to automatically attempt to restart that pod or completely recreate it in a fresh new state. We make use of deployments in a development environment, and we use them as the primary means of running containers in a production environment as well. So in this course, I first started off showing you pods just so you understand here is a very basic way of creating a container with Kubernetes. But in reality, when we start making use of Kubernetes for any serious purpose, we make use of deployments as opposed to individual pods. So from here on forward, we're going to kind of tend to forget that pods exist, and we're going to instead make use of deployments for running all of our different containers. Again, behind the scenes, a deployment is just making use of pods, so it's still very important to understand what a pod is and how you work with one. But again, we're going to make use of deployments in our development and production environments. Now, last thing I want to show you is just a very quick diagram here of what's kind of going on behind the scenes. So when we create a deployment object, it's going to have attached to it something called a pod template. A pod template is essentially a little block of configuration file, or a little block of configuration that says, hey, here's what any pod that is created by this deployment is supposed to look like. So the pod template might say, okay, every pod that this deployment manages is supposed to have one container that has a name of client that exposes port 3000 and uses the image multi-worker. And so that deployment would use this template to create a pod that looks like this. A pod that has a name of not client pod, just simply client. It's running the multi-worker image, and it exposes port 3000 to the outside world. If we made a change to the pod template over here, like let's say we're instead supposed to expose port 3000, we change that to 999 like so, then the deployment would attempt to either change the existing pod that it's managing, or alternatively, it would attempt to kill this pod entirely and replace it with a brand new pod that has the correct port assigned to it, like so. So again, this deployment object over here is going to be constantly watching all of the different pods that it maintains. It's going to be watching their state and making sure that they have the correct state. So at the end of the day, to solve this issue that we're having right now with updating the configuration for our pod, rather than trying to make use of a pod and update the container port, we're going to instead refactor this thing to instead be a deployment that creates a pod running the multi-worker image and with a very specific container port. Once we make use of the deployment, all those restrictions around updating certain variables, like say the container port right here or the name of the container, will be lifted. With a deployment, we can change any piece of configuration tied to a pod that we want to. We don't have to worry about seeing that error message like we did previously. Okay, so let's take a quick pause right here. We're going to come back in the next section. We're going to start to refactor our client pod file, or just completely recreate it for that matter, and we're going to turn it into a deployment object type instead. So I'll see you in just a minute.